All right, so the
Okay, let's go again.
dedication is for all the Cholim of Klal Yisrael. And just teach us. I'm sorry, guys. I apologize.
Amen. Okay, so fridges and freezers. One may put foods into a fridge or freezer. A bulb which lights up the fridge when the door is open must be unscrewed, i.e. made inoperative before Shabbos. When one wishes to open the fridge door, it is preferable to wait until one hears the hum of a functioning motor. Opening it at any other time might activate the thermostat and trigger the motor. Some freezers incorporate fans designed to reduce internal moisture, which stop operating when the door is opened. One must either open the door only when the freezer has been inactivated by a present timer, or deactivate the fan before Shabbos, taping down the protruding button.
I think, you know what, these are actually questions that you need to ask when you buy a fridge. Because you want to try to buy a fridge that doesn't have these type of issues with just the light bulb. Generally, the type of fridges that we can afford generally don't have it, except the light bulb issue. And Damon's point about holding the door open too long. The very fancy fridges, those type of things would have that built in, maybe.
And they also have a slight alarm when the fridge door is open too long. Because it's also...
But the fancy ones like your Samsungs and your LGs and the
listen,
the
out
top,
of my
the
price
top of the
range.
range.
I heard of such a thing. It's not my price range. Mine is a half-hour corporation special.
It's good enough from
I want to see you guys going to Pick and Pay and say, guys, I'd like to look to the guy in the front, it's not Jewish. To get you a fridge, it doesn't do this and do that.
Exactly.
It's like, it keeps it cold. That's what he'll say to you. What do you want?
Exactly. Danny.
And then we're recording us. If you can not be in the picture without your shirt, it'll be awesome. Sorry.
No problem. All right, guys, let's get started. That was well. Hope you guys all had a wonderful Shabbos.
Yeah.
All right. The challenge is deflected. So I tell you what, there's a challenge to Rav. The challenge, okay, guys, we're on 47b3. They challenged Rav on the basis of the following brisa. If a woman entered a homeowner's domain to grind wheat without his permission, and the homeowner's animal ate the wheat, he is exempt from paying it. If the animal was harmed by the wheat, she is liable to pay for the damages. But according to Rav, why must she pay? Because we learned previously it should not have eaten, and therefore it is not her responsibility. So the challenge is deflected. They're saying, is this brisa superior to our Mishnah, which similarly states in its second clause that if the homeowner's animal was harmed by produce that had been brought in without his permission, the owner of the produce is liable, and which Rav interpreted as referring only to a case where the animal slipped on the produce and was injured. This brisa too may be understood as referring to this case and not a case where the animal was harmed by eating the food. The Gemara therefore wonders, and the one who asked the question, what did he intend to ask? Did he not know that the brisa can be interpreted like the Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, he would tell you the following. All is well with respect to our Mishnah. If the homeowner's animal was harmed by it meaning the produce, this can readily be understood as meaning that the animal slipped on the produce, as Rav said. But here in the brisa, which stated if the animal was harmed, and it does not state by it, the logical interpretation is that it was harmed as a result from eating. And that's to which the brisa refers. The Gemara explains why this inference is not compelling. And there, the other one who defended Rav would tell you that there's no difference whether by it is stated or not. Even the brisa which omits by it may be interpreted as meaning that the animal was harmed by slipping on the produce. Okay, so what the Gemara is saying in very fancy language is saying, look, you could either have this as an issue that has to determine with permissions or non-permissions. But here we are saying that there was even a case where permissions aside, the owner of that produce is not liable if the animal ate because it ate of its own accord. Nobody forced the animal to eat. Whereas without permission implies that as far as the slipping is concerned, the animal didn't see it was there, and that's a different issue. So the brisa is saying it's talking about eating, and the Mishnah is talking about slipping. So it's just saying, look, the Brisa is never superior to the Mishnah. The Mishnah takes precedence, and the Brisa is non-specific. It's not a contradiction at all. All right, let's move on. Yet another challenge to Rav is incited. Come learn a proof from the following Brisa. If one brought his oxen to the homeowner's courtyard without permission, and the ox ate the landlord's wheat and developed diarrhea and died, the landlord is exempt from liability. But if he brought in the ox with the landlord's permission, the landlord is liable to pay damages. But according to Rav, why is he liable? The ox should not have eaten. So what the Gemara is saying is that, look, if it's a case of permissions, it seems that Rav does not hold the owner of the basically the owner of the ox, the owner of the property liable, because it's not for the ox to eat. In other words, it's a case of it's the ox's fault for eating. It's not a permissions issue. So Rav said, do you compare the Brisa's case where the ox was brought in with permission to Rav's case where the animal was brought in without permission? These cases are not analogous at all. When an ox was brought in with the landlord's permission, the landlord accepts upon himself the responsibility of guarding the other fellow's ox in the manner of a custodian, and therefore is liable to pay even if the ox chokes itself. So Rav is basically saying, look, he holds by the rabbis, not by Rebbe, it would seem, that when the owner gives permission for the person to bring in the ox, it's not only that he's no longer a trespasser, but the fact that he obviously is assuming custodianship, like an unpaid custodian. And therefore, if anything happens to the ox, even if it chokes on the produce, just like an unpaid custodian is held liable, so too, in this particular case, there's liability, which lets me state, guys, that an unpaid custodian does have less liability than a paid custodian, but there are still levels of responsibility, including negligence. Okay, so what Rav is stating here is that there seems to be a connection, exactly according to the rabbis, of permission and guardianship. Whereas Rebbe turned around and said, listen, just because you're allowing the person into your property doesn't mean that you've decided to become an unpaid custodian all of a sudden and are going that far in terms of your responsibility. You're just allowing the person permission. So Rav is going according to the rabbis. Rav, however, ruled. Now, this is not Rava, this is Rav. Rav, however, ruled that when one merely placed produce in the fellow's domain without permission, so that he did not assume custodial responsibility for the landlord's animal, if the animal eats there and dies, he can claim that it should not have been eaten. Okay? In other words, when he doesn't undertake the custodial responsibility to guard the landlord's animal, the only basis for holding him liable would be the law of bor, the pit, or obstruction, or a stationary obstacle, for example. And as has been explained, Rav maintains that this law does not obligate him to pay where the animal brings damage upon himself. Okay. So a related inquiry is cited. They inquired, in a case where a landlord accepted upon himself the responsibility of guarding something that was left in his domain, okay, so obviously that position is according to the rabbis of the Mishnah, where he gave permission for the item to be left in his domain, or in a case of Rebbe, where he made a specific statement that he said, listen, not only am I allowing it into my domain, but I accept responsibility. So with Rebbe's opinion, the default position is there's no responsibility unless the person states, and then the rabbis say implicit permission is responsible. Okay, so in that particular case, they want to know, do we say that it is only the responsibility of guarding against his own damage that he accepts upon himself, or perhaps is it even the responsibility of guarding against damage from the world at large that he accepted upon himself? In other words, does he undertake only that his own ox maybe wouldn't gall the cow left in his domain, or that his own dog wouldn't bite it, according to Rashi? He didn't, however, undertake to guard the cow against damage, like a damaging outside ox, for example. Okay? Or do we say that he even undertook to protect the cow from being caught by an ox that enters the yard from the street? So, like basically...
or different degrees.
Correct. Exactly that. Okay, so so here's a resolution that's offered. Come learn a proof. Rav Yehuda bar Simon taught the following brisa in Tractate Nezikim of the school of Karna. So you have different Tanaic schools, okay? So Karna is one of the famous schools. Well, Karna was actually an Amoraic school, by the way. So what did they teach? If one brought his produce into the homeowner's courtyard without permission, and an ox came from elsewhere and ate it, the homeowner is exempt from liability. But if he brought the produce in with the homeowner's permission, he is liable to pay. So who does this brisa mean is exempt from liability in the former case? And who does it mean is liable to pay in the latter case? Does it not maybe presumably mean, guys, that the owner of the courtyard is exempt from paying for the produce because it was placed in his yard without permission, and the owner of the courtyard is liable to pay for the produce in the latter case where it was placed in his courtyard with permission? So the Gemara is proposing, thus we see that a landlord allows something into his domain, assumes responsibility for it, he must guard it even against outside sources. That's what's proposed by the Gemara. It would seem like that from this brisa. Does that make sense? So the truth of it is the Gemara is saying it's not true. Okay? The landlord isn't liable in either case. Obviously, the first case because there was no permission, and the latter case because his animal, his property didn't damage it. There was an animal that basically wandered onto the premises. So rather, the brisa meant that the owner of the ox that ate the produce is exempt in the case where the produce was left in regard to being without permission in the yard. Okay? And the owner of the ox is liable for the produce in the case where it was left in the yard with permission. They inquired, in a case where a landlord accepted upon himself the responsibility of guarding something that was left in his domain, what is the extent of his liability? Do we say that it is only the responsibility for guarding against his own damage that he accepted upon himself, or perhaps it is even the responsibility of guarding against damage from the world at large that he accepted upon himself? A resolution is offered. Come learn a proof. For Rav Yehuda bar Simon taught the following brisa in Tractate Nezikin of the school of Karna, which was an Amoraic school. If one brought his produce into the homeowner's courtyard without permission, and an ox came from elsewhere and ate it, he is exempt from liability. But if he brought the produce in with the homeowner's permission, he is liable to pay. Who does the brisa mean is exempt from liability in the former case, and who does it mean is liable to pay in the latter case? Doesn't it presumably mean that the owner of the courtyard is exempt from paying for the produce in the former case, where it was placed in his yard without permission, and the owner of the courtyard is liable to pay for the produce in the latter case, where it was placed in his courtyard with permission? Thus, we see that when a landlord allows something into his domain and assumes responsibility for it, he must guard it even against damage from outside sources. So what the Gemara is proposing is that at the end of the day, is that the homeowner, it would seem, would accept responsibility for the produce, both from forces and damaging forces within his property, as well as forces that come in from outside properties. That's what it would seem. And the Gemara says, no, that's not true at all. What's it actually saying? It's the landlord is not liable in either case. It's not the landlord's responsibility. In the first case, because he didn't give permission. And in the second case, because nothing under his ownership, including himself, caused the damage. It was an ox that entered his premises. Okay? In fact, the owner of the ox that entered his premises without permission is liable. In the case where the cow that was in the homeowner's premises gained permission, because it now gained the protection of the homeowner. So what do we akin this to? I'll give you an example now. So what difference is there whether the produce was left in the yard with permission or without permission? The Gemara responds, they say, when it was left in the yard with permission and then eaten by a trespassing ox, this is a damage through the tooth in the domain of the damaged party. Exactly as Kevin said, Shane. And when an animal damaged through the tooth in the domain of the damaged party, the owner is liable. But which owner? The owner of the ox. When the produce was left in the yard without permission, this is a case of damage by the tooth in the public domain. And when an animal damages through the tooth in the public domain, she is exempt. All right, so let me just explain to you what I'm saying here, guys. Kevin hit the nail on the head. So, Kevin, what you said was completely correct. When produce is consumed, that's for physical gratification. It's shame. Right. It's a shame damage. Now, shame damage and regal damage are exempt in the public domain. Okay? You're only liable if your ox consumes produce in the field of another, or you've got a cow that eats produce or stands on pottery in the field of another. But in the public domain, where all animals have permission to be in that thoroughfare, it is not your responsibility for the animal to eat and to walk as it may. So, the implication is as follows, is that when Reuven says to Shimon, I want to bring my produce into your yard to look after it while I go away, he then, the homeowner, says, I accept responsibility for myself and my animals and my possessions damaging your produce. But you can also see this property as being part of your property, since I've allowed you permission. And since we have a shared property, any foreign animal that comes in to eat your produce is protected because it's now private property. Okay? It's our shared private property, and therefore any trespasser is responsible to pay for eating your produce under the category of shame. However, if the trespasser left produce there, it's as though it's a public domain, because he has no permission to have his produce there, neither does the ox that trespassed have permission to be there. So it's like damage caused in the public domain without the protection of shared property of the homeowner. Therefore, it's as though it was eaten in the public domain, and the owner of the ox that ate the produce is not liable. So therefore, guys, rather ask permission, because you get the protection of the homeowner, because it's considered like a shared yard and private property. So any shame damage caused by external forces would then have the protection of the homeowner, even though it's your produce, because you were granted with permission. Let's go to the next step. Okay. The Gemara attempts again to resolve the inquiry. And what inquiry are we trying to resolve? Well, very simply, how much responsibility do you have when you allow somebody to leave their goods in your premises? Are you an unpaid custodian where you have to look after it if anything happens? Or are you merely allowing them access to your premises without taking on the responsibility of custodianship? Okay. So the Gemara attempts again to resolve the inquiry. Come learn the resolution from the following brisa. If one brought his oxen to the homeowner's courtyard without permission, and another ox came from elsewhere and gored it, he is exempt. But if he brought in an ox in the courtyard with the homeowner's permission, and another ox came in and gored it, he is liable. Who does this brisa mean is exempt in the former case, and who does it mean it is liable in the latter case? Does it not presumably mean that the owner of the courtyard is exempt from paying for the ox in the former case, where it was brought in his yard without permission, and the owner of his courtyard is liable to pay for the ox in the latter case, where it was brought into his courtyard with his permission. Thus, we see that the landlord allows something in his domain and assumes responsibility for it, and he must guard it even against damage from outside sources. So, guys, the first case was an example of Shane. Okay? And then we're saying that no, in the case of Shane, it's not the homeowner's responsibility. Okay? If an external factor comes into his property to consume the produce of somebody that left produce in his premises. Okay? So it's saying here, well, what's with the case when we talk about carrying damage? Because again, with carrying damage, we're saying, well, where does the liability lie? It seems from this that the homeowner is seeming to take responsibility when permission is given to also look after that ox. Not only to allow it in the premises, but also look after it, because it uses the term exempt without permission and liability with permission. So he's saying, is that what it seems? But clearly, I'm sure, as you derive from the case of Shane, if it's the responsibility of the trespassing ox that ate the produce, we see here that an ox that trespassed and did carrying damage is probably responsible too. Let's see what the Gemara says. The proof is rejected as above. No, the landlord is not liable in either case. Rather, the brisa means that the owner of the ox should, that gored, is exempt in the case where the damaged ox had been brought into the yard without permission. And the owner of the ox that gored is liable in the case where the damaged ox had been brought in the ox with permission. So, guys, again, it's stating here that, listen, it seems that the homeowner is granting permission but is not accepting responsibility for external sources. It's the owner of the ox. But what is interesting is that if you've trespassed and you've kept your ox or your produce there, the other trespassing animal is not responsible. Why? Because it's treated as a public domain. You have no more right to that premises than that trespassing ox. So let's see what the case of Keren. So the Gemara objects, and it says, if it is so, that the brisa refers to the owner of the ox that gored, what difference is there whether the damaged ox had been brought into the yard with permission or without permission? With respect to damages through goring, Keren, the domain of the damaged party is treated no differently than the public domain. So the Gemara is saying, listen, understand in the case of Shane. In a case of Shane, we know in the public domain, for Shane and Regel, you're not liable. We get that, we understand that. But in a case of Keren, you're liable whether it's a public domain or a private domain. For if your ox gores, your ox has no permission to gore. So what difference does the category of domain, and again, when I ask permission to store my goods, either my produce or my ox, in your property, you are giving me rights to your property. In other words, shared rights, which means if an external party comes for produce, it's deemed Shane that they're almost eating as if they're eating in my yard, because we like joint owners, right? Because you say giving me permission, therefore you're liable. But if I don't have any permission, it's like I'm trespassing, I'm in public property, and so are you, so you don't owe me for Shane. But for Keren, it doesn't make sense. Why? Because Keren, you owe money if your ox gores, whether it's in the public domain or the private domain. So do you remember, guys, we learned a slight difference. Whose opinion is it that there's a difference between public domain and private domain? Let me give you a clue. Okay, let me give you a clue. There is one particular rabbi that turns around and says, if we take a tame ox, Gavin? Okay, we're waiting for Gavin. feel like I'm in a 1920s silent movie.
You just need the music, the piano playing, eh?
Yeah.
What about Arthur? Arthur is the disappearing, the invisible man in this episode, eh?
Yeah,
Damon?
but he is hearing us. He's just on.
No. But I'm talking about in the picture. He's invisible from the picture.
Yeah. Listen, what I'm doing when I'm reading the Gemara is I want to take something that's complicated and make it simple.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah, but I can tell you something. Eli is brighter than me. There's no question. I can tell you. There's absolutely no question. He's of a different level. Really.
Everyone's at different levels. You may be brighter than him on another level. Everyone's got different talents as well.
Guys, I'm back on. I'm so sorry. I can't find this charging cable, man. It's normally right here. It's something. Anyway, I've got my headsets up.
At what point did I lose you, Gaff?
The beginning of the show.
Yeah, but that's not special. I lose everybody at the beginning of the show.
I know. I'm not trying to feel special. I'm just being accurate. About a couple of minutes ago, 3 minutes.
The rabbi's opinion. You're saying which Rov's opinion? You were
all right. So,
about...
Gavin, what I'm saying is there seems to be a bit of an oddity. In the case of Shane, it's easy to understand because there's always a difference that we learn between with Shane and Regal. In the public domain, you exempt. In the domain of the damaged party, you liable. Now, if I don't get permission to stick my produce there, I don't have any permission. It's like I'm in the public domain. And therefore, if your ox eats my produce there, you're not liable because you're not liable for Shane in the public domain. If I get permission from the homeowner, we almost have a shared domain because it's a shared agreement. I can keep it there. And therefore, it's as if you ate my produce in a shared property, which means you're liable for Shane. But what we understand is we don't understand when it comes to Keren, for goring, why you would be liable any more in a private domain than a public domain, because you're liable for Keren in a public domain also. So we're saying, all right, we've established it's not the homeowners, it's the owners of the ox, just like it ate the produce. In other words, it's saying, look, the homeowner doesn't have to be responsible for external sources outside his property. It's enough that it seems that he's responsible for himself and his animals eating the produce. Or if you bring a cow to your friend's premises, you ask him permission and his ox gores it, he's responsible for that according to the rabbis, but not from some external source that happens to trespass. Okay? So we're saying, okay, so we see that, but I don't understand why in the case where you ask permission, when the trespassing ox gores your cow, why all of a sudden it would be liable in the shared premises, but it wouldn't be liable if you didn't get permission, because you're liable whether you get permission or not, technically, because it's a public domain. If you're treating it as a public domain for carrying damage, you're liable. Doesn't matter. Private, public, it doesn't matter. So the Gemara says no. There's a particular rabbi that we learned, and that rabbi has taught us that there are full damages for tum damage in the property of the damaged party. Okay? You remember?
I remember that oak. Not his name, but I remember him.
Okay. This was discussed in the 24th and 25th daf. It was Rabbi Tarfon who rules that a tum's liability is limited to half damages only when it goes in the public domain, guys. But when it goes in the domain of the damaged party, it pays full damages. And Rav Tarfon is disputed by the sages who maintains that a tum never pays more than half damages. And we discussed this at length in the 24th daf. Your neshamas remember, that's the main thing, at least when you get to the next
No, I do remember. And I nearly said Rabbi Tarfon. I nearly said it.
I know you did.
It was on the tip of my tongue.
You did say it, Gavin. No, you did say it.
No, I didn't.
I heard you say it.
Okay, we give it to you. You haven't
later.
said it. You should care.
I'll send you an e-wallet. I didn't say it. I should have. It's like one of the few rabbis that I actually remember. That's why. But anyway.
So
we spoke about him at length for a long time.
Exactly. So the Gemara responds, they say, whose opinion is stated in this brisa? It is the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, who says that for abnormal keren, what's abnormal keren? Where it doesn't have a track record, tam, in other words, tam damage that takes place in the yard of the damaged party, one pays full damages. Accordingly, the law is as follows. When the damaged ox was brought into the yard with permission and then was gored by a trespassing ox, this is a case of damage through keren in the domain of the damaged party. Why? Because the owner of the cow and the person, the homeowner, have agreed that they can share property in the sense that his ox is allowed to be in that property. Okay, so it's almost seen as a shared private property. But when the damaged ox was brought into the yard without permission and then gored, this is a case of keren in a public domain, and he pays only half damages. There's still half damages in the public domain, according to Rabbi Tarfon. When the brisa states that in the case where permission had been granted, he is liable, it means he's liable to pay full damages. And when it states that in the case where permission had not been granted, he is exempt, it means that he's exempt from paying full damages and instead pays half damages. Thus, the inquiry cannot be resolved on the basis of the brisa. So we're saying, yes, the owner of the ox pays, not the homeowner. So that's why the brisa can't sort it out. In fact, if even Arthur remembers, we talk about a kol v'chomer and a dayu. So the kol v'chomer was stated as follows. Let me just give it to you from memory. Is that since for Shane and Regel you were exempt in the public domain and you paid full damages in the private domain of the damaged party, then for keren damage, when you were liable for half payment damages and you weren't even liable for half payment for Shane and Regel, then in the damaged party's yard, for sure you pay full damages. But what did the dayu came to limit it to paying from the damages from the ox of the attacking animal?
It was our first dayu that we ever did, I think.
The first dayu
that I remember.
Yes.
Yes. No, in Bava Kamma. I've done it before, but I'm saying
you've done kol v'chomer, but not the dayu, exactly.
No. Well, we might have done it as I didn't.
Okay, so a related incident is cited. There was a certain woman who entered a certain house with the homeowner's permission to bake bread there. A goat belonging to the homeowner came, ate the dough, became overheated and died because obviously the dough wasn't cooked properly and expanded in the animal's stomach. Rava obligated the woman to pay the homeowner the value of the goat. Okay? So just remember, she gained permission to be there. Okay? And Rava obligated the woman to pay the homeowner the value of the goat. Shall we say that Rava disagrees with the opinion of Rav? Because what did Rav say? Rav said again, if you get permission, remember it talked about a woman that was grinding wheat. Okay?
I remember vaguely about this dayu you're talking about.
Yeah, no. So a woman came and she ground wheat, but she got permission of the homeowner. Rav said that she's not liable because she could turn around and said, the animal shouldn't have eaten. I didn't feed the animal. It did it of its own volition. I got permission.
And
only if I don't get permission do I have to pay for poisoning your animal. And I can't. Yeah?
It wasn't not so long ago, you discussed poison. If someone left poison there, that's negligent. But wheat is not, this is the different case because it's not.
Correct.
Correct. So you can't really.
So we even saying in the case of that of the poison, is there was a case where you never forced the animal to eat, but there was two opinions with poison. But anyway, as far as normal food is concerned, it's not your fault if the animal overindulges. If you've been granted permission to be there, because if you're not granted permission, so the thing of it is that why is that brought? Because it seems to say, look, you're not responsible if you ask permission to be there to look after the animal, and if it died, it's not your responsibility. You didn't say that you would actually be responsible for that animal that ate, but the homeowner then would say, look, he's not responsible if your produce got damaged. That was a sort of a school of thought. But the bottom line is here, we saw that if a woman gained permission and she was, preparing wheat, grinding wheat, and the animal ate and died, she's not responsible. So that's the opinion of Rav. Rav has said that in this case, she's held liable for the dough. So do we say then that Rava disagrees with Rav? That even when you gain permission, if your dough causes the death of an animal, your food, you're now still liable. Whereas Rav says you're not because you asked permission. So we're asking if Rava and Rav disagree. Okay? The Gemara rejects this. Okay? Why does the Gemara reject this? For Rav said above regarding the case where one placed produce in another's domain without permission and the homeowner overate and died and should not have eaten. The Gemara rejects this. They say, is this a comparison? There in Rav's case where the produce was brought in without permission, the one who brought it in did not accept upon himself the responsibility of guarding the homeowner's animal, and he can therefore claim it should not have eaten. Here, however, when the woman entered the house to bake with the bread, she asked with permission. She accepted upon herself the responsibility of guarding the homeowner's animal from damage, and thus cannot claim it should not have eaten. Okay, so let's just clarify what we said. We said in 47b3, guys, they challenged Rav on the basis of the following brisa. I'm going backwards, guys. If a woman entered a homeowner's domain to grind wheat without his permission, and the homeowner's animal ate the wheat, he is exempt from paying for it. And if the animal was harmed by the wheat, she's liable to pay for the damages. But according to Rav, why must she pay? Let her say it should not have eaten. Okay? So what we're saying is here, is that in the other particular case, it was saying Rav is only talking about if an animal slipped on the produce, not if it ate it. So let me just give you a bottom line. The place where it originally said it was 47b3, and we're now in a place of 48a1. So it's saying, look, is it a case here of permissions? Because it seems that if you never ask permission, you're better off because you're not liable. And when you ask permission, now you suddenly have to pay. You're worse off. So how could you be worse off if you ask permission? They're saying, well, if you ask permission, then you basically, the suggestion is that you're taking on liability. You're taking on liability to guard your produce at the homeowner's place. Maybe that's it. That's what's proposed, okay? So what's the differences there when the produce was left in the yard with permission or without permission? The Gemara responds, they say that when it was left in the yard with permission and then eaten by trespassing ox. Sorry, hang on a sec, guys. However, here, when the woman entered the house to bake with permission, she accepted upon herself the responsibility of guarding the homeowner's animal from damage and thus cannot claim that it should not be eaten. Okay? In other words, she was obligated to ensure that it wouldn't eat the harmful dough. So this isn't to be construed as meaning that anybody who requests and receives permission to enter another's domain automatically assumes responsibility for guarding only the homeowner's property from damage. Rava himself said on 47b that he does not assume this responsibility. Why? Because, say, for example, you've got pottery. If I come and I say, can I leave pottery in your home? Why would I want to leave pottery in your home? Because I'm not going to sit there watching my pottery all day. I'm obviously leaving it there, and I'm not pretending to guard your animal against damaging itself against my pottery. So, for example, if your cow stands in my pottery and it gets a shard in its foot, but the homeowner knows I've gotten permission to be there, the homeowner should know not to put its animal by the pottery or should put the pottery away, but I haven't accepted that I'm going to protect my pottery against damaging you or your animal just because I've asked permission to be there. And so too, it's saying, well, what's the homeowner's responsibility? Is it the homeowner's responsibility to protect your property when you're no longer there just because it's allowed you to be there? Remember we just learned this. And we said, what is the case of a potter and the animal? Well, we said that the potter is basically, the potter is not liable, but the homeowner is. I don't know if you remember us discussing that. Because the minute the potter left, he leaves his responsibility, but the homeowner, if it gets damaged, is liable for it. But by the same token, just because he's liable for your pottery, do you remember, guys, we said even if a wind breaks it, or is he liable? Remember that whole question? Because does he now take on the role of a custodian? You haven't taken on the custodian role of preventing your property from injuring his animal because you left the premises. But since it's on his premises, is he only giving you permission to store it there? Or does he take on the property responsibility like an unpaid custodian, that if your pottery gets damaged, he has to pay? Remember, that was how we left it on Thursday, guys. So we're seeming to say here that we don't understand. It seems that if a woman brought in wheat and was grinding it without permission, in that particular case, she didn't accept responsibility, so if it died, it died. Okay? And then, in this case, the woman asked if she could bring in her dough and use the guy's oven maybe to bake the dough, etc. And therefore, she's liable. So it's saying, how can you be more liable if you bring in and ask permission? Suddenly, have you taken the role as the custodian of your produce or your pottery, that you saying if you ask permission, you now have to look after it? Is that what it's trying to infer? Okay. So basically, we say no, it's not the case. There's more to it than that. So how's this different from the case mentioned in the Bryson 47b concerning a woman who enters a homeowner's domain to grind wheat without his permission, where the Bryson ruled if the homeowner's animal ate it, he's exempt from paying for it? We know why he's exempt, because she didn't ask permission. But by the same token, if his animal was harmed by it, the woman is liable to pay for damages, but not according to Rav. Because according to Rav, the animal shouldn't have ate it, but according to the rabbis, it seemed that because there was no permission granted, there's liability if there's harm. Guys, do you want me to put it in a summary sentence or not? Gavin, can you give it over to me?
No, I can't give up anything today. My back's bad, but I'm listening to you. I can hear
All
you,
right.
but I can't give it over.
All right, so what we're saying is...
I can give it over tomorrow maybe, but not today. Sorry.
Okay, so what we're saying, Kevin, is as follows. In a case on 47b where a woman entered a homeowner's premises without permission to grant wheat, maybe he had a pestle and mortar, commercial pestle and mortar, and she was there grinding wheat. In that particular case, if it damages one of the animals, she is liable. In other words, the animal slipped on it or he ate on it, etc. Okay, in that case, Rav only holds her liable if the animal slipped on it, but not if he ate it, because the animal shouldn't, she never fed it to the animal. Does that make sense? Slippage is something different. But the rabbis say, if you didn't get permission, any damage your produce causes, you're liable. And so too, if the animal didn't get harmed, but ate her produce, she doesn't have a case, because she can't claim that the homeowner knew it was there and therefore had any right to protect it against his property, like his oxes consuming it. So in either way, Kevin, she is liable if she brings something there without permission if it causes harm. And if it's damaged, the homeowner is not liable. In this particular case, she asked permission, and yet she's still liable for the damage it caused to his animal. So we're saying why? Why is that the case? And we're asking, is there also a case where Rava and Rav disagree? Because Rav said he disagrees with the rabbis, and he said, look, you're not liable if the animal overindulged itself and ate, because that's the animal's fault. Whereas the rabbis say if you didn't have permission to be there, you are liable. Okay? Rava is turning around and saying that in this particular case, that the woman that where one placed produce in another's domain without permission, and the homeowner's animal overate it and died, you are obligated. So we're saying, hang on, does Rava agree with the rabbis and disagree with Rav? That's all it's asking. And it's saying, well, how do you compare the two? Because hang on a second, Rav is not disagreeing with Rav. Basically, in the case as far as Rav is concerned, there's no permission. Okay? There's no permission. So why should you pay if the animal overindulges? Here in the case of the woman with the dough, as opposed to grinding the wheat, there is permission. So where you say you have to pay, what's this case? So it says, look, there's a different reason in this particular case. And the reason is as follows. The Gemara explains its question. We may infer from the Brisa that the reason she's liable is that she entered his domain without permission, but if she would enter with his permission, she would be exempt from paying damages. Thus, we see that a woman who receives permission to perform a chore in another's domain does not automatically assume responsibility for guarding the homeowner's property from damage. Okay. So what we're saying is she responsible if she enters with permission, or if she's not responsible? So they say, look, this is a very different case. And the reason why it's a different case is that a woman that basically bakes bread, rolls up her sleeves, right? And she's immodest when she's pushing the dough. And he has to leave his premises while she's doing it. He can't watch it. And therefore, when he leaves his premises, he's no longer looking after her dough like he would look after her property or her pottery. Because remember, it's the homeowner's responsibility to look after the pottery, etc., if there was permission granted. That was the discussion. We're saying here it's not his responsibility because she's immodest. When she grinds wheat, it can be done modestly. When she's actually kneading dough, she needs to get her hands dirty and take off some of her overgarments and expose her arms, and therefore he can't be on the premises. Therefore, if he's not on the premises, she now is obligated to oversee operations, and anything that happens to his property, she is liable. So that's not indicative of general responsibility. Does that make sense? Okay, so the Gemara answers, they say, when a woman enters another's domain to grind wheat, since she does not require any privacy while performing this chore, the owners of the yard need not remove themselves from it, and therefore the responsibility of guarding the owner's property rests on him, as it did before she entered. But when a woman enters another's domain to bake with permission, since she requires privacy for this task, the owner of the yard automatically removes themselves from it when they grant her permission, and therefore the responsibility of guarding the property rests on her.
But shouldn't he say that as he leaves the room? He says, listen, because of sneers or modesty, exactly, I'm leaving the room, please take over.
No, it's a given. It's a given. He doesn't have to even state. It was a custom in those days that obviously women, certain tasks, men couldn't be around. So therefore the given was he has to leave, and then the result is that she's now responsible. Somebody has to look after the produce and prevent the animals from harm.
No, it's a good. The point you made is taken. It's that it was customary.